Mr. Banga, thank you very much for joining us for the CNBC exclusive. I do want to start by talking to you about the big announcement that's come in, which is the India, Middle East, Europe connectivity corridor that has been announced. And I wonder what role would the World Bank play in financing that project?
Yes, I was there right now actually at the announcement. The financing is coming out of a number of the countries that are involved with it, the EU and the Saudis and the UAE and the Americans and the European countries. What we're involved with is probably downstream as things get implemented. We get activated with it and help them roll it out.
But is it a timeline that's being laid out on this front?
No, in fact, it's just fresh off the press. So I think you should expect tangible plans to come out after this. So I think it's a very ambitious idea, and it's got the right idea, which is to build an economic corridor connecting India all the way into Europe and through the Middle East. So this is the right kind of thing to do.
A natural solution to geopolitical tensions emanating out of Russia and China?
I think this is more about finding a way to connect what are the future trading routes. When you go back in time, this was an old trading route. This is almost like creating a new one that duplicates that. And I heard something very interesting, how they want to make it the green road. So basically hydrogen built into it, kind of the right connectivity issues. They're also talking about digital connectivity. So they're getting cables laid. I mean, this is really connecting populations across a large population here in India all the way into Europe. So
and enhancing trade between Europe and India, right? It would make it 40% faster.
It's excellent.
Right. I also do want to talk about President Joe Biden's remarks, calling for a bigger and more effective World Bank. And I wonder how much of that has to do with your working paper that you published last month, putting out your vision for the World Bank.
Well, I joined the bank with the specific request to re-look at the institution and take it from the last 78 years where it did a great job focusing on poverty, but really evolve it into the multi-channel crises that we have right now. We've got, it's poverty, but it's also pandemics and climate change and fragility and food insecurity. And these have come together in a way that changes the nature by which we have to use our playbook to do things. So I joined the bank as part of that change. And so what you're seeing all of us do and talk about is to change the mission and vision, take it from being poverty only focused to also a livable planet. So we're in the business of eradicating poverty, but on a livable planet. And then talk about the manner in which the bank can operate. Its partnerships with other multilateral banks. I just announced a big one with the Inter-American Development Bank, but also its partnership with the private sector. Because there's no way there's enough money in the multilateral development bank world, or even in governments or with philanthropy, that we can drive the kind of changes we need to do for these poly crises. And so getting the private sector's capital and ingenuity into the game is going to be very important.
But how much capital are you seeking from the private sector? Because, the lending capacity that is being proposed to be expanded is by $25 billion, with of course, the chance of it going up to as much as $100 billion. But I wonder whether that's enough, because when you compare if you just look at sub-Saharan Africa's overall debt profile, that's $800 billion, right?
No, we're not solving debt profiles. So just to be clear, our capital doesn't go into reducing people's debt, because that's not what
but financing projects, sir.
Yes.
But I'm saying from that standpoint, is it a small amount?
Yes. So I think what the main thing here is the bank, despite its $120 billion that it committed last year, this is not what's going to change the total requirement of capital required. Just for renewable energy in the developing world, you need $1 trillion a year by 2030. That's why you need the private sector. I don't have a target for the private sector. I do have the idea that if I could get a certain amount of money in the bank put into, say, renewable energy, could I get the private sector to put 1:1, 2:1, 3:1? What's your ambition is the issue.
What are the terms and conditions that you're willing to offer to draw in and make it more attractive for the private sector to come in?
The idea of this capital that we bring in is twofold. One is to create the right feasibility studies, project studies, the right policies. If you get the right policies in place, there's plenty of studies done that reduce the cost of reaching somewhere, even with the SDGs, by half. What do I mean by policies? The right government policies, regulatory policies. Should the electricity tariff reflect cost or not? Are you sure that you have a predictable policy for the next 5 years and predictable regulations? These kinds of things enable the private sector to feel that stability, clarity, consistency, and they'll bring money. They can deal with execution risks, they can deal with distribution risks. What they can't deal with is the uncertainty of a political system.
But time is of the essence over here right now, Mr. Banga, because primarily, we are living at a time when rates are high, the cost of capital is rising. So a lot of private companies would say, we need to keep our house in order. We need to prioritize how to keep the business running rather than invest elsewhere.
Actually, there's no shortage of money seeking renewable energy investment in the larger economies in the developing world. I've met lots of investors who are keen to get in. They've got ideas. Remember that now renewable energy basically is proven and at scale. So you can produce with solar and wind and geothermal at scale and cheaper than fossil energy. 10 years ago, that was an issue that you were talking about, Tanvir. Today, that's not an issue. They've got the idea that they know that these projects can be built to make money. What they need is the right predictable political, social, regulatory environment. They need the right kind of startup, maybe, or first loss positioning. I was giving someone an example, tangible example. Let's say you're putting up a solar energy plant, and it's a $5 billion investment, and it takes 5 years to get made. What if the World Bank came in and took $1 billion of that on our balance sheet during the period of gestation, with the deal that the day you start receiving revenue from the utilities, you buy out the bank, or somebody else in the private sector buys out the bank at a pre-agreed profit margin? That reduces your risk during the gestation period, reduces your FX exposure. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Let me address the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah, sure.
How much of the World Bank's role expansion has to do with countering China's rising influence as a preferred development financier or lender?
So I've said this earlier, China is actually a big shareholder in the bank and has been a very consistent partner. And in fact, we met the Chinese premier and the finance minister today. So they're very much a part of the solution for the bank. The bank is a multilateral institution. Of course, the US and parts of Europe are large shareholders, but so are Japan, China, India is getting larger. So this is a different thing. I don't believe that the bank is an instrument in an either-or situation. I think there are definite geopolitical issues in the world. We know those. But the bank's trying to find a way to not get into that, but actually focus on this idea of poverty and livable planet.
But does that mean that you would be attending the BRI summit as well next month, where you're talking about 90 countries being in attendance, President Putin meeting President Xi, and the foreign ministry in China has actually said that in the last 10 years they've worked on 3,000 cooperation projects and galvanized nearly $1 trillion of investment. I mean,
so the World Bank has a very low role to play at BRI, so I don't plan to be there. But I will go to China sometime next year at one of their, for example, they have the China Development Forum. I plan to be there. So you shouldn't read any message into whether I'm at this event or that event. I'm very clear that China is very much a shareholder and very much a constructive partner in our work, as are many other countries.
Right. Two questions I'll take before I wrap up, and that is on India. Okay, you said that you are very optimistic about India and have been so more so than what you've been in the past, right? This is a time that you're very, very optimistic on India. What makes it different this time? What makes now different for India?
If you look at the facts right now, first of all, India has done enormous investments over the last couple of decades in infrastructure, digital and physical, right? And so that changes a lot about the logistics in the country. Logistics costs as a percentage are still too high in some corridors, but it's much different from what it used to be. There's a whole manpower sort of advantage that India has of young people coming out of these training institutions and colleges. So now, if we can get them the right jobs, then it's a dividend for India. But I'm seeing it more from the perspective of economic growth and opportunity. Consumption is growing. India is not an export-driven economy, so it's a consumption-driven economy. And so if you look at the fact that the world has challenges with trade, in the negative impact on India of that challenge is lower than it is in other countries. So in many ways, India's economy right now happens to be fit for purpose. And it's showing up by the fact that you've recovered much better from the pandemic. You're one of the bright spots. ASEAN and India are among the bright spots, along with the United States, that is showing enormous strength coming out of the COVID crisis. So I'm quite optimistic about where India is.
And what about collaboration between the US and India in terms of going forward as the two countries look to strengthen their ties?
Well, I think they've done an enormous change. When I first started getting involved with the US-India Business Council, I remember ties were just beginning to move. I think there's a huge change now. There's a strategic relationship that covers defense and geopolitics, of course, but you can see that the personal equation between the countries is developing in the right way. So we'll see, you can't tell, but I think this is headed in the right direction.
Mr. Banga, lovely to have you on the show. Thank you
Pleasure
very much
to
for
see you.
joining us.
Thanks.